This was touched on a little bit earlier, but I want to try to bring the war home. That's been my goal ever since I first went to Iraq. So I want to, that's what I want to try to do tonight. And I want to start with Washington State. So far, at least up until a couple of days ago, 80 members of the U.S. military from Washington State have been killed in Iraq. According to the National Priorities Project, the war has cost Washington State over $10.5 billion. Instead of using that money in Iraq, it could have insured over 6 million children for 1 year, or hired an additional 183,000 public school teachers for a year, or built over 95,000 additional public housing units. It's interesting to watch the media now about Iraq, where because public opinion in the United States has shifted so dramatically over the last year, 2 years, where it's become almost in vogue to at least start touching on the refugee crisis a little bit, almost in vogue to talk about, yes, things are quite chaotic and the infrastructure's in trouble and there is corporate profiteering by the likes of Bechtel and Blackwater now. And if you're a retired general that used to be a functionary of this invasion and occupation, now there's a long line of retired generals, and there's this interesting phenomena that seems to be happening, that once you're a general, particularly the high-ranking generals, once they retire, all of a sudden their testicles drop. The latest in the newfound testicle club, former CENTCOM Commander General John Abizaid. CENTCOM is the U.S. military headquarters of the Middle East in Doha, Qatar. And he was speaking about the Iraq War at Stanford University. And again, when you hear about him or anyone else speaking at Stanford University, that's where the Hoover Institute is, which of course the retired general is now a member of. Big shocker. And a member on leave from the Hoover Institute, another one would be Condoleezza Rice. So when you hear these people speaking at Stanford Stanford University, it's really the Hoover Institute. So the middle of last month, retired Commander General John Abizaid was speaking there about the Iraq War, and he said, quote, "Of course it's about oil, we can't really deny that." He went on to say, "We've treated the Arab world as a collection of big gas stations. Our message to them is, guys, keep your pumps open, prices low, be nice to the Israelis, and you can do whatever you want out back." Just a few days ago, on October 31st, he was speaking again at a different university this time, and Abizaid admitted that it might well be 50 years before the U.S. ever leaves the Middle East. And we all know that the war was sold on lies and misinformation by the Bush administration. And what drove me to go to Iraq was because the administration never could have accomplished that without a completely complicit establishment media. And I want to talk about a few of those instances because this is essentially what made me hit a point where essentially for my own mental health, I decided this is so out of control. One thing I can do to fight against this media complicity with this administration is to go to Iraq. And I want to just discuss briefly a few of those events that really made my blood boil. The first of these it happened on September 6, 2002. Then White House Chief of Staff Andrew Card was speaking about the PR campaign for the Iraq War. And he said, quote, "From a marketing point of view, you don't introduce new products in August." And where was the establishment media on that? With few exceptions, it was just broadcast without question, and no one really went out of their way to point out here's this White House chief of staff discussing a PR campaign and a war in the same sentence. But launching the PR campaign is exactly what was done. The very next day, on September 7, 2002, George Bush and Tony Blair stood together at Camp David and declared that they had evidence from a report published by the UN International Atomic Energy Agency that showed that Iraq was 6 months away from building nuclear weapons. The only problem was no such IAEA report existed. So maybe I was overly idealistic and naive at the time, but I thought, because I was reading the UN's weapons inspectors reports, and I was reading enough foreign media to know that this whole thing was a wash. And I was idealistic enough, I think, to expect establishment journalists here in the broad media outlets like the New York Times, the Washington Post, all of the national television networks, to hold the administration's feet to the fire. I was idealistic enough to think that a journalist's job is to monitor the centers of power, that if people are going to be making claims and allegations like this, particularly if it's going to lead a country into war, then they better damn well back that up with evidence. So one would think from that perspective that the next day, after the September 7, 2002 claims, baseless claims made by Bush and Blair, that the front page of the New York Times would have read something like, George W. Bush and Tony Blair stand together at Camp David, citing evidence from a report that does not exist. If I could find that out, a regular person, a regular citizen of the country, reading news off the internet, reading UN information, why couldn't those so-called journalists? And instead, the next day, instead of investigative journalism, monitoring the centers of power, we had a perfect example of what John Pilger refers to as propaganda disguised as journalism. On September 8, 2002, the front page story, the lead story on the New York Times, co-authored by none other than Judith Miller and Michael Gordon of WMD fame. Michael Gordon, of course, still working for the Times. They proudly quoted their favorite source, an anonymous, quote, Bush administration official, as saying, quote, Iraq has stepped up its quest for nuclear weapons and has embarked on a worldwide hunt for materials to make an atomic bomb. That's why I went. That was my red line. I was a regular person living in Alaska, working in the mountains as a guide and a rescue volunteer in the summers, a little bit of freelance journalism on the side, and I had enough. I think everyone here, like Ben said, everyone here, every American soldier serving in Iraq, every person in Iraq, everybody has a red line that when you cross that red line, then something has to change, something has to give. And I think it's really, really important that everyone here recognize that you all have a red line as well. Some of you may well have already crossed it. The IVAW guys have crossed theirs. A lot of the ISO folks, the organizers, the activists, myself, we all have our red lines for whatever it is that we feel deeply passionate about. And once that red line is crossed, then it's time for us to take action. And so that's what happened to me. I basically decided to go to Iraq because my own mental health, I was going crazy sitting in Alaska watching all of this happen. I decided I could go over there and start writing about it. And so I went over to Iraq in November 2003 with a laptop, a digital camera, a little mini cassette recorder. And I just started writing literally what I saw. Journalism is not rocket science. You don't have to go to journalism school. You have to be able to write. You have to be able to see what's going on and take notes accurately and fact check. And of course, there's basic skills. But I got up to speed really quick once I got over to Iraq, working with other foreign journalists and working together with these people and started reporting. And I want to talk about a few of these instances. to give you an idea of how quickly the occupation was going south, even early on in the occupation, and contrast it with updated information of how those situations have degraded, but also contrast it with how many of these events were reported by the mainstream media. The first one I want to talk about sheds a lot of light about why the level of violence is so high in Iraq today, why almost 4,000 soldiers have been killed, and the number wounded. Now I think the Pentagon's talking about it somewhere around 30,000 or so. I want to be real clear that it was less than a year ago the Pentagon readjusted how they classify wounded soldiers. When they made that adjustment, there were over 53,000 wounded soldiers. And now it's back down to around 30,000. Interesting that a statistic like that could actually go backwards. But the first incident I want to talk about was it occurred in Samarra in late November 2003. Basically what happened was the U.S. military had a patrol in downtown Samarra. It came under attack by a small resistance group, and the patrol, according to the military, the patrol fired back because the resistance group was actually a huge contingent of Saddam's Fedayeen. These are basically Saddam Hussein's shock troops or his special forces. And it was a really crazy statement for the military to make because up to that date, there had never been one instance of an organized, uniformed contingent of Saddam's ex-military attacking the U.S. The military completely dissolved once his regime fell, most of which before, actually. And to date, there hasn't been another instance of that happening since. So, according to the military, 150 Fedayeen attack this patrol. They fight back valiantly and kill 48 Fedayeen. Overnight, the number goes up to 54 with no reason given for the increase. So a few friends and I decide to go up to Samarra and see what's happening. We go up there, we go straight to Samarra General Hospital, and we interview doctors, people wounded, gunshot victims in the hospital beds, and talk to the mortician, because it made sense, if we're going to get to the bottom of this, let's see the bodies. And we found 8 civilian bodies. And the doctors, the mortician, and all the wounded people that we talked to in the hospital said the same thing, which was that a U.S. military patrol was in downtown Samarra. It was attacked by a small group of maybe 2 or 3 fighters who then fled, as is the nature of guerrilla war. And the patrol opened up on basically everything that was moving in downtown Samarra. And these 8 civilians were killed, and there were a couple of dozen of people wounded there in the hospital. And we then went to speak with a tribal leader, one of the sheikhs of the city, and he basically confirmed our story, but he gave us a little bit more information about what had happened and what had led up to the event, that in fact there had been collective punishment going on by the U.S. military to the people of Samarra for many, many weeks, because every time a patrol came under attack, the entire city would be, the water would be cut, the electricity would be cut, sometimes supplies would be cut, etc. So that's the context of this short bit I'd like to read you. The sheikh told us he had advised the military to remain outside the city. The military had taken his advice and left the city several weeks prior to the bank incident. The incident that I had just described occurred right in front of Samarra's bank. However, collective punishments such as water and electricity cuts were soon imposed, along with cuts in food and medical aid shipments. Sheikh Naqshbandi told us that U.S. forces began raiding homes within the city during the night. The sheikh added, "They committed atrocities in these homes they were entering in the night. They were detaining so many innocent people. This is sure to come back at them like a boomerang." His report was similar to a statement made by Ismail Mahmoud Mohammed, the U.S.-appointed police chief of Samarra, who just after the incident at the bank asked a reporter with the Financial Times, "Were the French happy under the Nazis? It is the same thing here." He went on to say that the occupation forces had long since gone too far in their provocations of the residents of Samarra. Sheikh Naqshbandi told me an old Arabic proverb about how the people of a city always know more about their home than anyone else. He said because Samarra consists primarily of 7 large families, the people there knew everything that occurred. He continued, So where are the other 46 bodies the U.S. speaks of? So all these 46 other bodies are flying. The Americans took them in their tanks. Where are they? Show them to me. The sheikh asked, so what are the people to do? The attack, is not an action. What you have seen is a reaction. If the occupation power continues to hurt and humiliate the people here, every man will become a bomb. At the time the sheikh made that statement, suicide bombings were rare in Iraq, yet less than 1 year after that interview, there was going to be at least one suicide bombing every single day. In that type of incident where patrols are attacked, random shooting, free fire zones, and especially now with the massive escalation in the use of air power across Iraq and the death squads, we can go on down the line for the different generators of civilian casualties in Iraq. But I want to mention again the statistic that was mentioned during the introduction, and I think it's the single most important statistic of the entire occupation of Iraq, and that's the number of Iraqis that have been killed, followed very closely by the second most important statistic, which is the number of U.S. soldiers that have been killed. But speaking specifically, the number of Iraqis that have been killed, we look to the Lancet report. It's a study conducted by Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Health in conjunction with doctors and scientists from Baghdad's Mustansiriya University. The legwork for that study was done in July of 2005. So this study is already well over 2 years out of date. It was published in the Lancet Medical Journal, a peer-reviewed medical journal akin to the New England Journal of Medicine here, and published in October of 2006. And that study found that there were 655,000 excess deaths, Iraqi deaths, caused directly by the U.S.-led invasion and occupation. That's 2.5% of the entire population of the country. If we were to translate that to this country, if we were to expand Iraq's total population to reflect ours, if we were invaded and occupied by, say, China, and there was massive violence and chaos and people dying all over, if 2.5% of our population were wiped out, that would mean that every person in Atlanta, Denver, Boston, Seattle, Milwaukee, Fort Worth, Baltimore, San Francisco, Dallas, and Philadelphia would be dead. Every single person. And that does not account for more recent adjustments to that figure made by the group Just Foreign Policy, which now calculates that nearly 1,100,000 Iraqis have died. We don't even talk about wounded. There's never been a study done on it, but just to give you an idea, I think it's very conservative and safe to estimate that there's been approximately 3 million Iraqis wounded. And I think that's being extremely conservative, because if you look at the U.S. military, for example, for every one U.S. soldier that's killed, approximately 10, a little bit more than 10 are wounded. So let's say conservatively that for every Iraqi that's killed, there's been 3 that have been wounded. But just to give you an idea of how catastrophic the situation has become, when the invasion was launched in March 2003, the total population for Iraq was approximately 27 million people. Now it's under 23 million. This is in addition to the people that have been killed. Actually, the statistics given of refugees by the UN are extremely conservative, very, very low, too low in fact, and I've confirmed this last summer when I was in Syria reporting on the refugee crisis. I spoke with the UNHCR regional information spokesperson, Sibylla Welks, and she said that yes, even just in Syria alone, we know our figures are far, far too low. The Syrian government's figures are far higher than ours, and we think those are far more accurate. We don't even have enough personnel to have someone on the border keeping track of how many people are coming. So if we look at Syria alone, there's nearly 2 million Iraqis. If we look at Jordan alone, there's over 1 million, and that's not even considering how many have fled into Iran, the Gulf states, and Lebanon. So as far as Iraqis who have fled the country altogether, we're now looking at well over 3 million people. As far as Iraqis who are internally displaced within their own country, it's just about 3 million. An Oxfam International report that was released this last July found that there's 4 million Iraqis, we're not including the refugees, there's 4 million Iraqis in dire need of emergency assistance. That means if they don't get access to safe drinking water, food, and medical care access, then they're literally at risk for their lives. So that means out of a population now less than 23 million people, we have 3 million people internally displaced, 3 million people that have left the country altogether, 3 million people that are wounded, 4 million people in need of emergency medical care, and 1 million dead. That's 14 million people. That's 14 million people out of Iraq's 23 million people are either refugees, wounded, in need of emergency assistance, or dead. That is how catastrophic the situation has become. It baffles the mind. It's almost impossible to grasp what that really means, other than the entire country has been eviscerated by the US-led invasion and occupation. Now I want to talk about one of the causes for the invasion and occupation. Of course, we all know about oil. Abba Zaid even said so. But let's talk about privatization. I want to read a short bit about the gasoline crisis that I saw early on in the occupation, and I imagine Ben and a lot of the other IVAW guys are aware of this too. As far back as December 2003 in Baghdad, we had massive gasoline shortages, huge lines at the gasoline pumps, and that's what I want to discuss. That's the context that I'd like to read to now. This is in December 2003. Walking back to our hotel, we passed a small, decrepit petrol station with 2 lines of cars stretching as far as we could see, waiting for gas. There was a separate line for black marketers, who were lined up with jerry cans and plastic jugs awaiting their chance. The black market was burgeoning. Those who could afford the extra costs were less willing to wait in the ever-lengthening lines as the gas crisis worsened. The black marketers took their plastic jugs to the petrol stations, filled them, walked down the street a few meters, and used siphons and plastic funnels to pour gas into the empty tanks of those able to pay a little extra. Everyone from small children to elderly men on crutches were doing this. Meanwhile, short-tempered Iraqis were jamming their cars toward the pumps, some having slept overnight in their cars in order to keep their place in line. And the Americans tried to tell us this war was not about our oil, yelled a man while pushing his car. He agreed to talk with us as long as we stayed out of his way. Even under that bastard Saddam, we never had benzene shortages. I'd seen these lines all over Baghdad. Gas lines were so thick in some areas that traffic would often get choked down to a single line, further aggravating the already impossible chaos of Baghdad's auto congestion. Some of the men we spoke with in the fuel line were aware of the fact that Halliburton's subsidiary, KBR, had just been caught by the Pentagon for grossly overcharging them by importing gasoline into Iraq from Kuwait at $2.65 per gallon. Iraqi concerns were able to do the job for just under $1 per gallon. Halliburton, which had Dick Cheney as its chairman and CEO from 1995 to 2000, before he relinquished his position in order to become vice president of the United States, was unabashedly looting the Pentagon. By this time, Cheney's old company, which he still had financial ties with and had obtained billions of dollars of contracts in Iraq. No one knows exactly how much money has been contracted in total, but as of the time of this writing, Halliburton's overall contracts for log cap and oil infrastructure rebuilding have totaled approximately $20 billion in Iraq. Total expenditures on U.S. corporations operating in Iraq on reconstruction and other services is about $50 billion. LogCap is a logistic civil augmentation program with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which is Halliburton's largest government contract. Under this contract, Halliburton is responsible for providing supplies and services to the military on a global basis. Services include construction of military housing for troops, transporting food and supplies to bases, and serving food, to name a few. It's worth noting that it was Dick Cheney, as Defense Secretary in 1992, who spearheaded the movement to privatize most of the military's civil logistics activities. Under Cheney's direction, $9 million was paid by the Pentagon to KBR to conduct a study to determine whether private companies like KBR should handle all the military's civil logistics. KBR's classified study conveniently concluded that greater privatization of logistics was in the government's best interest. Shortly thereafter, on August 3, 1992, Secretary Cheney awarded the first comprehensive log cap contract to KBR. The Washington Post reported, the Pentagon chose KBR to carry out the study and subsequently selected the company to implement its own plan. 3 years later, Cheney became CEO of Halliburton. After that, many of you probably remember this, when George Bush is running his campaign for the presidency in 1999, there is a committee formed to choose who the running mate is going to be. Dick Cheney volunteers to lead the committee. Dick Cheney chooses himself. And here we are. Since that time, the time of that writing, former Halliburton subsidiary Kellogg Brown & Root has received so far contracts in Iraq now well over $20 billion. A Pentagon audit of $16.2 billion worth of KBR's work, quote, found that $3.2 billion in KBR billing was either questionable or unsupported by documentation. Now, Halliburton doesn't have the contracts for the infrastructure. They focus on the oil infrastructure and the U.S. military. But to give you an idea of what happens on the ground in Iraq, when companies like Bechtel don't fulfill their contractual obligations, and the dozens and dozens of other Western companies that had contracts to do things like rehabilitate the hospitals, schools, the water sector, the electricity, etc. The average house in Iraq today has 1 hour of electricity per 24 hours. 70% of Iraqis do not have access to safe drinking water. Inflation is 70%. Unemployment vacillates between 60 and 70%. What was our unemployment here during the Great Depression? 33, 35%? Between 60 and 70% unemployment. Bechtel, just to give you another example, we're all hearing about Blackwater now. Let me remind you that Bechtel, who withdrew from the country entirely in November 2006, earned $2.3 billion for their Iraqi contracts. Many of their projects were never even started. That Oxfam International report I mentioned earlier also highlighted the fact that nearly half of all Iraqis are now living in abject poverty, 45% of them living on less than $1 per day. Child malnutrition has increased 9% since the invasion occurred in March 2003. That's an increase over the period of the sanctions. We all remember the famous Madeleine Albright quote, 500,000 dead Iraqi children. We think the price is worth it. 9% increase in malnutrition since the sanctions. I'd like to talk a little bit, very briefly, about Fallujah. I want to read what happened after the April siege. Many of you are, I'm sure, well aware of the April siege itself. An assault launched on the city in retribution for the 4 Blackwater mercenaries killed there on March 31st, 2004. The order came directly from the White House to launch that siege. At the end of that siege, there were 736 people killed, and doctors I interviewed at Fallujah General Hospital in May told me that they estimated approximately 60% of those were civilians. But I want to read a short bit from the book, because again it highlights the media disparity of what I saw by going into Fallujah on May 10th, myself, Unembedded, as compared to what embedded reporters saw on that day, because the siege ended because the military basically couldn't take the city. And so they backed off, and an agreement was reached between them and fighters in the city that they were going to be allowed, for the media primarily, to run one last token patrol into the city. And that occurred on May 10th. And I happened to be in the city on that day, and I was standing there by the road. And the agreement was that the patrol could go from the main highway to the mayor's office in Fallujah. It's about 2 miles. And they were given a grand total. The resistance basically said, you have 1 hour to get in and out, and we're going to attack you. And so the military loads up, and they run this huge patrol, this huge convoy into the city, Bradley fighting vehicles, Stryker vehicles, armored Humvees, and they were surrounded by Iraqi police and Iraqi Civil Defense Corps, army men basically, most of which, of course, were mujahideen. It should be noted, too, we look at the U.S. policy in Al-Anbar right now. Basically what the U.S. did after they failed to take Fallujah in April is they armed and backed all the fighters in the city. They gave them money, they put them on the payroll, they gave them armor, they gave them radios and trucks, they gave them even guns at times, and said, okay, the city's yours. And that's exactly what they're doing in Al-Anbar right now. But I was standing there watching this patrol come in, and it was very interesting because I watched in one of the Stryker vehicles, the embedded reporters were all wearing black helmets. And one of the interpreters that I was with, she laughed because she recognized one of them. She's like, oh yeah, I worked with that guy in the past. He's an NPR reporter. So that's the context while we stood there and watched this huge patrol come in. They went into the mayor's compound, went inside a giant concrete surrounded building, and they sat there while their commander went in, did the photo op with the mayor, shook hands, they loaded back up and rode back out of the city. A few people waved at the Iraqis who were accompanying the patrol, who tentatively waved back to them. I spotted a couple of soldiers who, thinking the waving was for them, waved back. The embeds, as usual, had no idea what the Iraqis in the city thought about all this. They never talked with any of the Iraqi doctors, medical workers, or families of the victims. Clustered together in the back of a Stryker vehicle, peering out from under their black helmets, the embedded reporters saw the scene only from the perspective of the U.S. soldiers they relied on for their safety. Thus, they could not see what I was about to witness after they departed with the soldiers. As the patrol receded, this is as they're going back out of the city, spontaneous celebrations erupted, and crowds of residents flew into the street. Iraqi flags appeared everywhere. People began chanting and waved the flags wildly. Members of both the Iraqi police and ICDC joined in the celebration, waving their guns in the air and giving the victory sign. A parade was quickly formed. Trucks with boys and men riding in the backs lined up, their horns blaring. Policemen who were there to guard the Marines promptly turned into parade escorts as well as participants. The ruckus began to inch down the street. An old Fallujah man riding in the back of a truck waving a tattered Iraqi flag yelled, "Today is the first day of the war against the Americans. This is a victory for us over the Americans." Mujahideen brandishing RPGs, Kalashnikovs, and hand grenades were paraded on trucks as thousands of residents began to move up and down the main street in the victory parade. Loud music blared from the minarets of mosques. Ahmed Sadun Jassin, an Iraqi policeman, smiling from ear to ear, said, "I can't describe to you the happiness I feel right now. This is a victory for Islam." Many of the policemen in ICDC were holding their weapons in the air with one hand while giving the victory sign with the other. When I asked about their having cooperated with the Marines, Jassin said, "This was the deal that was negotiated. They couldn't stay in Fallujah for over 1 hour, which they didn't." I was pulled up into the back of a pickup truck. We were all being pelted by handfuls of candy thrown by shop owners at the crowds who passed. Many of the revelers were waving Iraqi flags. Some held up the Quran. Vehicles carrying armed mujahideen and rejoicing residents rolled up and down the main street of the city. Iraqi police and ICDC members, along with the mujahideen, were firing their guns into the air. Men held up children in the air, their small fingers spread in the V sign, a fistful of candy in the other hand. An RPG-wielding fighter riding on the top of our truck told me, they, the Marines, just made the people of the world laugh at them, but I think they will come back because they don't keep their word. The celebrations continued throughout the day. After several hours, the parade dispersed, but small groups of honking cars full of triumphant flag-waving Iraqis continued to buzz around the streets. Children ran around carrying flowers toward mosques. People planned more celebrations for the evening. Boys set up water and juice checkpoints, giving cups of juice to cars that slowly passed through the street. I watched more children waving flowers about as they played in the sun that had now come out. Despite tremendous loss during the fighting, the will of Fallujah residents apparently had been galvanized. The press release from the 1st Marine Division about the patrol stated that freedom of movement in Fallujah was crucial to the city's rebuilding and revitalization efforts. The officials added, quote, teamwork serves notice to those who violently oppose stability in Iraq. They are nothing more than unwanted barriers on the road to a truly free Iraq. One last thing I'd like to read. In my reporting, focuses very, very heavily on how this has affected the Iraqi people. And I don't want to overlook the fact, and it's actually how I basically end the body of the book, by quoting a very noted, world-renowned psychiatrist, Robert J. Lifton. Robert J. Lifton took it upon himself to figure out how is it possible that human beings carry out atrocities against other human beings. He did studies about how people in Hitler's regime carried out the atrocities they did during the Holocaust. And then he did studies again of Vietnam. How did American soldiers in Vietnam do the things they did? Why were veterans coming back with necklaces filled with chopped off ears from Viet Cong they had killed? And that was completely normalized to them. And then they were surprised when they would walk up to someone here and people would be horrified by this. How were things like My Lai possible? And again, he's done the same thing with Iraq. Basically, Abu Ghraib grabbed his attention, and he's written about it, and I'd like to read some of his words. In an article titled Conditions of Atrocity, Robert J. Lifton cited both My Lai and the Iraqi prison of Abu Ghraib as examples of what he called, and these are his words, atrocity-producing situations, so structured psychologically and militarily that ordinary people, men or women, no better or worse than you or I, can regularly commit atrocities. In Vietnam, that structure included free fire zones, areas in which soldiers were encouraged to fire at virtually anyone, body counts, with a breakdown in the distinction between combatants and civilians, in competition among commanders for the best statistics, and the emotional state of U.S. soldiers as they struggled with angry grief over buddies killed by invisible adversaries and with a desperate need to identify some enemy. This kind of atrocity-producing situation surely occurs in some degree in all wars, including World War II, our last so-called good war. But a counterinsurgency war in a hostile setting, especially when driven by profound ideological distortions, is particularly prone to sustained atrocity, all the more so when it becomes an occupation. I've learned through a lot of experience giving presentations after dumping a lot of very bad news on people that it's helpful to try to end on at least somewhat of an up note. So towards that effort, I'd like to close with a poem by poet and author Marge Piercy. It's called The Low Road. What can they do to you? Whatever they want. They can set you up, they can bust you, they can break your fingers, they can burn your brain with electricity, blur you with drugs till you can't walk, can't remember. They can take your child, wall up your lover. They can do anything you can't stop them from doing. How can you stop them? Alone you can fight, you can refuse, you can take what revenge you can, but they roll over you. But two people fighting back to back can cut through a mob. A snake dancing file can break a cordon. An army can meet an army. Two people can keep each other sane, can give support, conviction, love, massage, hope, sex. Three people are a delegation, a committee, a wedge. With four, you can play bridge and start an organization. With six, you can rent a whole house, eat pie for dinner with no seconds, and hold a fundraising party. A dozen make a demonstration. 100 fill a hall. 1,000 have solidarity in your own newsletter. 10,000 power in your own paper. 100,000 your own media. 10 million your own country. It goes on one at a time. It starts when you care to act. It starts when you do it again after they said no. It starts when you say we and know who you mean. And each day you mean one more. Thank you.